I didn't stop it. But I honestly don't know if it records the whole time from this microphone or just. All right, so the next drug class, actually the next three, deal a lot with what we call cell mediators, meaning that the way cells talk to each other, okay? The way cells get each other to do what they need them to do, all right? So the first one is what we call mast cell stabilators. Mast cells are some of those cells that line your airway, and they're used primarily in the context of asthma because what happens is when we inhale an antigen or an allergen of some sort that our body says, hey, this is a protein that is not us, then it has what we call an antigen-antibody reaction. And what happens is these mast cells rupture and release these chemicals into the airway that cause the airway to immediately constrict, bronchoconstrict, okay? So these mast cell stabilizers suppress that effect, so that even when the person inhales an antigen, they don't have this reaction, even though they are allergic to that substance, okay? So there are inhaled versions, oral versions, nasal sprays, and even ophthalmic forms. Two commonly used ones are cromolyn and metochromol. Depending on the way that it's administered, it may cause the client to have sneezing and coughing or even irritation in the back of their throat, and they might even feel nauseated from time to time. Mast cell stabilizers are not rescue medications. They are control medications, meaning that once the person is already having a reaction to an allergen, these drugs are not useful. Okay? This is something the client takes when their asthma is under control to stay under control. The question is, do they stay on it pretty much constantly? The answer is yes. If their asthma has progressed to the point they need this, then they probably need it all the time. Now, there would be some clients that you could issue a disclaimer on and say, well, they only need it during the spring and the fall for the allergies that they are specifically sensitive to are greatest. Okay? The question is that kind of like what's in an allergy shot? No, an allergy shot is a little different. It's desensitizing your body to an allergen. This one is preventing you from responding to the allergen. Okay, so it's a little bit different. Leukotriene is another substance that is released. Okay, it's released into the airways, again, based on a perceived need. So when your body feels like it needs some help because it's getting too many things coming in the airway, it releases these leukotrienes and generates a response. So by antagonist, this medication group, this drug class, interferes with the receptor sites for those leukotrienes. So it doesn't matter how many leukotrienes are released, the receptor sites don't get to do what they're supposed to do when they are released. And so these part, that's, where's my cursor? These part in parentheses, this is what the leukotrienes are trying to get to happen. We want the airway to constrict. We want to increase the fluid and mucus of the airway so that it can tract. We want to increase the eosinophils to the area so they can fight the substance that we don't like, okay? So this drug class interferes with all of those by blocking the receptors for those leukotrienes. This too is not a rescue med. This is a control med. This is a drug these people take every day. And you've probably heard of them, Montelukast and Zafirlukast. I always think I'm part German when I try to say that, but basically that's your singular. If you've ever heard of singular. Common side effects is it can give clients headaches as well as those other things as part of that process. Okay? And the last drug class I listed there is a newer drug class called the PDE4s. And those of you who like to drop big words to your friends, phosphodiesterase, so that's an enzyme. Okay, so phosphodiesterase is an enzyme, and this drug class inhibits that enzyme. And when that enzyme does its job, it releases cytokines. Okay, so this drug class prevents airway inflammation by suppressing this chemical mediator or cell mediator called cytokines. It's very helpful in reducing what we call exacerbations. An exacerbation, in a sense, is a chronic illness occurring on a harder or deeper level than it normally occurs. So this person's dyspnea, or this person's hypoxemia, or this person's hypercapnia is greater right now because of an exacerbation. These drugs, once again, are controlled drugs. They are not rescue drugs. And they are oral, that's taken once a day. Roflumilast is the one that is maybe the only drug in this class. I'm not sure of on that one. Okay, and those are the side effects that we know of so far. And then these are things that we need to watch for, is it can affect their overall weight. And remember, these chronic COPDers are often underweight already because of poor nutrition. So there's a risk-benefit thing your primary care provider has to weigh out. All right? All right. So we're going to do our in-class activity. So all of you who brought a straw, I want you to get your straw out. If you have extras and your neighbor didn't bring one, please let them borrow one. Or if you happen to have your bandy scissors, cut yours in half, it'll still do its job. And if anybody in Stillwater needs some, I've got 3 extras that somebody brought up here. So if you forgot your straw, then bring your straw. Okay? All right, so what I want you to do is I want, give me just a moment. Let me remember my steps in the process. Okay, well, everybody stand up.
Do we need this on us? No.
And longer airway than you normally have. Okay? So sometimes it's real easy when we look at some of the chronic illnesses and we think, well, this was somewhat self-induced. You know, we look at the alcoholic and we look at their liver problems and we think, well, you know, you should have known better. And sometimes we look at the COPD patients and we think the same thing because they're heavy smokers. But recognize, regardless of how they got that illness, it's still an illness, and we need to show compassion. All right? Okay. Thank you all for participating with that. Now let's go to our nursing care. What are we going to do for these people if we really care about what happens to them? If we really are going to show compassion. Oh, I'm sorry. I got to backtrack for just a second. I mentioned the mast cell stabilizers, the leukotriene receptors, and the PDE4s. I said were not rescue meds. I left 4 other drug classes that I did not tell you, 4 or 5, 4. I did not tell you if they're rescue meds or not. So let's make sure we all are on the same page. Stillwater, are beta agonists rescue meds?
They're inhalers.
Say that. Yes, they can be used as a rescue med. So albuterol, for example, is a short-acting beta agonist that is commonly used in an inhaler form for those who have asthma or for those who have one of emphysema or chronic bronchitis but are having a difficult day. There are also long-acting beta agonists that can be used as a control med, but the short-acting are rescue meds. Anticholinergic agents, Tonqual, are those rescue meds or control meds? I heard one voice. Is that everybody's consensus? Okay. They can be used in combination with the beta agonists, but remember, because of their onset of action takes longer, they're not typically considered the first preference for a rescue med. They function better as a control med. Okay? So somebody might take a anticholinergic inhaler twice a day on a scheduled basis, but use a beta agonist in between when they need it. Okay? Enid, the methylxanthine, rescue med or controller med? Control med. Control, absolutely. Now, that's not to say that we don't use them in an acute exacerbation. In fact, the parenteral forms of aminophylline are only used in that context. So somebody might say, but that's a rescue. No, we're not going to wait for that drug to open their airways. They're still going to get the beta agonist while we're getting their IV started and getting their aminophylline drip ready, etc. Okay? So it is a control med primarily. Corticosteroids, back to Stillwater, what do you think? Rescue or control? Control. It's something they need to take routinely in order to help their airway and their inflammation control well. Okay, great job. Back to nursing care. So what are we going to do? Well, it's pretty obvious. The nursing process always starts with assessment, so anybody with a respiratory concern, we focus on that. But we don't neglect the rest of the head to toe unless they are unstable. Okay, if they're in respiratory distress, then that might be the primary thing we can focus on besides their vital signs. But we need more information as we get them more stable. So the vital signs and pulse ox are an absolute beginning point. Provide oxygen if indicated. Remember, it requires a provider's order or a prescription, or we can use standing orders. And remember, I've mentioned repeatedly during simulation, the only way a nurse can act upon standing orders is the patient must be symptomatic. In other words, a singular number, like a pulse ox reading, is not adequate to implement standing orders. Okay? So again, a COPD patient who comes in and they have a pulse ox of 90%, but their respiratory function, although it's not healthy, on that continuum it's not healthy, it's still their baseline, and they are not feeling any more short of breath than they have been. Okay? That's not someone we would place them on oxygen. BiPAP or CPAP. I think I'm at Tom, I believe. What does BiPAP stand for? And then Enid, yours is CPAP. BiPAP, what is that? Okay, it's positive airway pressure. So what do you think the bi means? Biphasic, very good. So Enid, what does CPAP stand for?
Continuous positive airway pressure.
Continuous positive airway pressure. So both of these are often the same device, but just a different setting on the device. And basically it's to help keep the smaller airways open so that a patient can exhale effectively and there's less air trapping. So if we can open up those little tiny airways for a chronic bronchitis person, or if we can help get airflow in and out of the patient's lungs for that emphysema patient, then we can promote gas exchange for those people without having to intubate them. And that's the value of BiPAP or CPAP. Always allow a person having respiratory distress to be in their position of comfort. So high Fowler's is most often their preference. Teach them how to use pursed-lip breathing so that they can promote gas exchange by not breathing so fast and shallow that they're really not getting air to their alveoli. Provide meds promptly, especially those fast-acting bronchodilators, as they are prescribed for that patient. Recognize that because they have a risk for infection, that we often have to collect a sputum sample and send it for testing to make sure that it's an infection, that they don't have an infection on top of their chronic illness. So part of what we want them to do, and what we do when they come to the hospital, is we monitor both the amount, the color, and the consistency of that sputum. Provide oral care. This is every 2 to 4 hours. That's a minimum. Provide oral care when they want it, okay? Basically, sputum that's nasty tastes nasty and makes their mouth feel nasty. People who breathe out of their mouth often have dry mucous membranes, and they have chronic bad breath. We call it halitosis. So provide them oral care for their comfort, and I'd say for everybody else's too. Assess and treat those nutritional problems. Because they cannot eat well they cannot eat and breathe simultaneously. Those are two different pathways in the back of the throat. And then many times they will sacrifice their nutritional need in order to breathe. Remember Maslow? He begged it. Remember, both of those are physiological needs, but even within the realm of physiological needs, we still have priorities. Our oxygen need is our number one need. You die fastest with a lack of it than anything else. So all of those 7 or 8 physiological needs are also prioritized by Maslow. And I don't know if it's in our current work guide, but it has been in the practical portion of your work guide in years past. And so it may be out there as well. But basically, these people need additional nutritional support. We're going to promote the clearing of secretions, and I've listed about 6 things on this slide that we can do to help do that. So the first one is increase their fluid intake to help their secretions remain thin. Remember, what you drink has to be absorbed into your bloodstream before it ever becomes a secretion. So you're not really thinning the secretions down if they already are well hydrated. But if they're not well hydrated, their secretions will often be thick and tenacious. And so by giving them an increase in fluid intake, and by that we're talking about, remember we said 1.5 to 2 liters is the standard for a healthy person? So we're talking about 2 to 3 liters for these people. Sometimes humidifying their air that they're inhaling will help keep their mucous membranes from getting dried out and getting those secretions from being less thick. Turn those people, or encourage them to turn themselves. Even if they have to keep the head of the bed up all the time to be able to breathe, they can still turn side to side to promote some of the draining of secretions from their peripheral airways down to the central airways where maybe they will cough. Teach them how to cough effectively, recognizing that, like we talked in the fall, that for some clients, deep breathing and coughing isn't an option. We already said these people already have a barrel chest. A deep breath for them is trivial to you and me. So we teach them what we call a huff cough. And I think I demonstrated this last fall for you already. So if I didn't, then let me know. But otherwise, huff coughing works better for these individuals than traditional deep breathing. But deep breathing and coughing can work for an asthma patient in between an asthma attack, okay, to help keep their airways clear from infection. Chest physiotherapy. Remember, that's our postural drainage and percussion. So again, respiratory therapists are often assigned to do this, but nurses have the freedom to do it if they perceive the need as well. Just recognize that some of these clients, because of their chronic condition, their chronic poor respiratory function, cannot tolerate a head-down position. Okay, so you may have to be a little more creative than that. Suction if necessary. And by this suctioning, we're not talking about deep tracheal suctioning. That would require much more invasion than they would tolerate. But we're talking about posterior pharyngeal. If they can only get it up to the back of their throat, but they still can't get it out of the airway, we can help them with that. Okay? We call that nasotracheal suctioning. All right, so what are some teaching and health promotion things we can do to them? Well, it sounds like a broken record, but this will make the biggest difference for so many of them. Okay? we need to help them understand the connection between what they enjoy doing and what they are now experiencing in order that they might make a better, more informed decision. However, I do want to make sure that you understand that knowledge does not equal change. Simply teaching somebody something does not mean they will change their behavior, and we still need to support them. Oxygen safety. So part of the readings I pulled back into your readings was how to administer oxygen safely, because some of these people will spend the rest of their lives wearing it at home. You're not going to, I'm not going to, no nurse is going to be around to monitor that. So we've got to teach them how to use that safely, and their families. So the obvious one is no smoking or sources of ignition. Well, remember if you recall from the fall, I talked about how oxygen is heavier than air. So when somebody has a nasal cannula or a Venturi mask, and they're not taking out all of the oxygen from what they're receiving from those devices. So where's the surplus oxygen going?
Around
Absolutely. It's falling down on the surface of wherever they are. So the surface of their clothing, the surface of their chair, the surface of their bed, if they're lying in a bed somewhere. And all of a sudden, that fills up from the ground up. So the longer they're on that source of oxygen, the higher that level of oxygen is growing in that room. And it simply takes a single, and so those who think, we often have COPDers who are still addicted to tobacco smoking, or even now to vaping. They think that, well, if I just take my oxygen out of my nose and lay it aside, I'll be fine. And what they don't realize is, no, that oxygen is still all around them. And there are some pretty phenomenal movies where somebody tries to sneak a cigarette who's been on oxygen therapy, and literally their bed and them are engulfed in flames within seconds. Okay? It's a terrible way to die. No petroleum-based products. So everything that we use as far as needs to be water-based. Concentrator oxygen versus tank-based. Tank-based means those big green cylinders that you sometimes see welders use, perhaps. A tank-based source of oxygen must be secured, because if it falls over and it breaks the head of that off, it will shoot through anything in its pathway like a torpedo. So patients need to know that if they're going to use a tank-based oxygen source at home, how to do that safely. Make sure it's secured to the wall, or make sure it's always in its cart and chained in place so it doesn't fall over and break the tip of that off. Concentrator. Concentrator takes the air in the patient's room and condenses it, if you will, so that what is the level of oxygen in a standard room at this altitude? What percentage of that is oxygen that you're breathing in? 21%. So an oxygen concentrator takes that, compresses that air, and improves the percentage of oxygen in what is being sent through the tubing to the patient's nasal cannula. So a concentrator is a less expensive way for someone who's on chronic oxygen therapy, but it's also electricity dependent. So one of the things that those clients must know is that if you use a concentrator, you still need a backup source of oxygen. So you need a small tank for those times when electricity goes out, or you need a generator, or you need your power company to know that you are oxygen dependent and are concentrator dependent, so that you'll be the first person who gets their electric restored during times of need. Okay? Ground yourself before touching the patient. During this time of the year, it's very easy here in Oklahoma for the air to get so dry that we have static electricity. Just the friction of our clothing on our carpet, walking across the carpet, we develop static. And if we are to go up and greet our patients in a hospital bed, and they're on oxygen therapy, and we reach out and shake their hands before we ever touch them, we might create an arc between our body and theirs that ignites the oxygen that's all around them. And now we've set them on fire. Okay, so touch the ground and bed before you ever touch your patient, so that if there's any displacement, it goes away from the patient into the electrical outlet. Okay? All right, nutrition. I mentioned nutrition is a concern, so I want to specifically deal with that because it is a big priority problem for these people. All right? So one approach is small meals. So they get tired very easily, and so our goal is to make sure they get their caloric and other nutritional needs met over time. It doesn't all have to happen in a single meal. So we want to increase their caloric intake, and we want to do it primarily by increasing their fat and protein intake and decreasing their carbohydrate intake. And the reason being is the way our body metabolizes each of those nutrients. When our body metabolizes carbohydrates, it gets a certain amount of energy. In turn, it creates a certain amount of carbon dioxide. And the ratio of that is such that it's not well split. When our body digests fats and proteins, it gets a certain amount of energy with a certain amount of carbon dioxide, but the benefit outweighs the accumulation of carbon dioxide. And so basically what happens is, because they have carbon dioxide problems, carbon dioxide retention already, if they eat pasta, if they eat mashed potatoes and gravy, if they eat a lot of bread, what ends up happening is that carbon dioxide level is being absorbed through their GI tract and their respiratory tract, and the respiratory tract can't get rid of it. And so it actually affects their blood gases. Liquids and soft foods are easier for them to handle because they can swallow quicker without posing a choking hazard, and they can then get on to the next breath. If a supplement is used, make sure that we use the ones that are designated for pulmonary clients, because those are specifically low in carbohydrates. The energy in those supplements comes from fats and proteins. So a common one that you will see in simulation, is Pulmocare. Encourage easy food prep or something that is pre-prepared for them. So that could be working with local resources like Meals on Wheels, or maybe a local church or community group that might be interested in bringing something in to provide for them. But sometimes when we're talking about working with resources, is we can make suggestions to them, but they don't have the money to buy those things. So make sure that what we're asking them to do is something that's within their means. And because of their preferences, something they will actually pursue. Another big problem they have is that lack of energy. Because the energy uses up oxygen, we need to help them learn how to conserve that oxygen and to conserve their energy. So the beginning point of that is have them do a diary of their daily activities. How do you spend your time when you're at home? And then help them determine, of those things they do routinely, what's the highest priority? If they could only do certain things in a given day, what are the things that matter most to them? Encourage them to use their inhalers before those activities so that their airway's enlarged and so they're at their best to be able to do it successfully. Teach them that even the most enjoyable activities don't have to be given up, but sometimes we have to break them down into smaller steps so that they can tolerate them. Smaller steps in the process, if you will. And then teach them how to plan for frequent rest periods. Now, when you look at that list, I've talked about it in the context of home, but it's also relevant when you're in the hospital too, isn't it? Only you and I play a factor within. We're the ones that help plan their morning and schedule those activities. We're the ones that determine when they're at their best to handle it in the hall, or to set up in chairs for breakfast or a meal. And we're the ones that often can limit visitors and provide them rest. Next one is exercise. This seems counterintuitive to what we just said, but yes, they need exercise just like everybody else. But recognize that exercise really doesn't improve their lung functioning, but it can strengthen their respiratory muscles because of that principle of respiratory challenge. So challenging their respiratory system and then it doing well enables them to do better in the future when they're faced with a respiratory insult. Progressive walking is the most common form that we recommend for these people with advanced disease. And what we mean by progressive walking is we have them walk to a certain level of shortness of breath, or perhaps to a certain level of O2 sat, or just a certain level of energy, and then we want them to sit down, and then when they feel rested enough, to walk 5 minutes further. And they gradually add to that time frame. So it might be you might ask them, start out by walking 15 minutes just there in your house. Now, recognize that to do progressive walking, some of them will need supplemental oxygen, some of them will not. Remind them to use that personal breathing and to concentrate on their breathing rather than to allow their anxiety and shortness of breath to cause them to hyperventilate. Even people with chronic illnesses like these still have social needs. They are still, as Maslow said, have psychosocial needs on all those other levels above those initial ones. So we want them to still be able to interact with people. And so sometimes that's doing some of those activities that they're going to be doing anyways. Just recognize they can't typically have a conversation and do either of those activities simultaneously. But technology is something they have at their advantage this time in history, so they might be able to have social interaction even long distance. The next concern is sexuality. Remember that all of us are sexual beings, and that doesn't change just because you got a chronic illness, and that doesn't change just because you got older. Those needs are still expressed in whatever way the person would like them to be. So they need to know that they can, in some situations, simply assume the more passive role in the process and still be able to meet each other's needs. They might need to use massage as part of foreplay, as opposed to physical exertion. And then let their partner play that more active role, okay? And then we already said that they're prone to infections, specifically pneumonia is what we're talking about. So our number one way to keep that infection from spreading is to teach them how important it is for them to use hand hygiene all the time, regardless of where they're at. Not just at public bathrooms, but even at home or wherever else they may spend their time. If they suffer from asthma or chronic bronchitis, it would be helpful for them to have some allergy testing so they could recognize what triggers their airway response so that they can avoid it. And so it might require some serious lifestyle changes for them. And just saying, I think I got some ideas on that one. So those lifestyle changes might be more than just giving up smoking. It might be giving up some of those things that they have enjoyed through the years, but have now accumulated dust or other even mold over time, and now is a source of allergen for them. Or it might even mean that their pets that live with them might need to be moved outside of the home. Teach them to avoid contact with those who have coughs or fevers, okay, so because they're so vulnerable to catch whatever that person has. And then they need to know when to contact the physician, when to contact their PCP. So if there's a change in the sputum, so color, amount, tenacity, change in their level of dyspnea, or if they develop a fever. We don't want them to wait and simply treat it with Tylenol or ibuprofen at home. We want them to come and find out what's going on so we can keep it from becoming a life-threatening situation. And then lastly, remember vaccinations. So remember, we need to encourage them to get their flu vaccination every year. And If they have not ever received the pneumococcal vaccine, they need to receive it and then re-receive it about every 5 years. Okay? Peak flow. I mentioned this earlier as one of the pulmonary function tests. Peak flow measures how quickly we can exhale air through a flow meter. Now, obviously, the flow meter that the client will use at home looks very different from a flow meter that you would have in a hospital context with a respiratory department. Okay, so that peak flow meter, the reason we want them to use it, we want them to use it twice a day and record, is because those values typically for an asthmatic patient will drop about 24 hours before they even experience symptoms. So they can literally see it coming before they ever feel it happen. So this says monitor daily. I think your book says twice daily and record, so like morning and evening. And then they're going to follow what we call their designated action plan based on those readings. And I'm going to show you that here. This is out of a previous textbook that we used to have. And show it to you if I do.
I think it's white. It just looks purple.
Okay. One thing I want you to see on this is just one example. They're not all going to look like this. But here's the main thing I want you to see is their zones are all based on their baseline peak flow meter reading. So they're before a provider and a nurse sets this up, they are going to get several peak flow meetings over a period of time. I think it's a week, during a time when they're not experiencing asthma symptoms. And they're going to use that as a reference point to determine which zone they're in. So as long as they stay in the green zone, as long as they stay 80%, can you see that right there? 80% or more of their best peak flow based on those baseline readings, then that means that they're going to take whatever their daily control medicines are, and this will be how much?
Was I good at it?